Eurofighter is now the most sophisticated fighter-bomber of the age. Switching role by voice command, it can fight air-to-air as well as air-to-surface battles in all weathers, day and night.
We have the ability to detect and shoot before the bad guys.
I would say it will be a very deadly machine, this is for sure.
Forged out of the collaboration between the UK, Germany, Italy and Spain, it will form the keystone of their air forces. First conceived in the early 80s, it has finally been delivered.
Whichever way you look at it, it's at least a decade late.
Billions of pounds over budget and surrounded by controversy. This is the story of Europe's biggest ever defence project. A project that has survived the blows of conflicting national interests, political intrigue and a changing world order.
Welcome to my office. This is basically where I go to work every day, and I can tell you I would not exchange this place for anything else in the world. And here, as you can see, is a huge airplane, but this is what I would say a pilot's airplane, really. I like it.
Test pilots like former NASA astronaut Maurizio Cheli have had a decisive role in the plane's design. Each of the 4 partner nations has built specific sections of the fighter.
And here, I would say my wing, because I'm Italian, but of course, and this is sort of a joke, and as such you should take it, because the airplane is made by 4 countries. For example, this wing was made in Italy, and the opposite wing was made in Spain. But they match, and this is what makes the airplane amazing.
Maurizio is about to strut his stuff. Cheli flaunts the plane's maneuverability to the onlookers at this year's Paris Air Show. Among them, defence analyst Andrew Brooks.
This is a European Air Force in making. I mean, this is a European dream, a combat airplane produced by Europe to take on the world militarily and to take on America commercially.
Once full production is underway, 120,000 Europeans are expected to be employed on this weapon of mass construction. Eurofighter's competitors are also out in force. National pride and tens of thousands of jobs are at stake. The French are making much of their rival plane, the Rafale. But 20 years ago, they were to be partners in what was to become the Eurofighter project. Their withdrawal was one among the many complications that has dogged the long and eventful attempt at European collaboration.
This is a story of Europe learning to stand on its own feet. It's done it very well. It had a traumatic evolution process. There were a lot of stumbles on the way. Let's be honest about this. Nations came into this, we didn't have necessarily a big record in building 5th generation sophisticated airplanes. They had to learn from scratch. And when you're at the leading edge, there are going to be problems. You're cutting edge technology. We shouldn't underestimate the challenge they took on.
It was the arms race of the Cold War that brought the project into being. During the 1980s, the Western Air Forces were deeply concerned about the technological advances the Russians were making. They had developed not one, but 2 very agile fighter aircraft. The planes were causing great anxiety, as independent analyst Paul Beaver explains.
The first was from the famous Mikoyan stable, the MiG-29, and the second was from the Sukhoi Bureau, the Su-27. Both looked, from intelligence estimates, to be better than the existing F-16 in service, mainly with the Americans and continental Europeans, but certainly better than anything that the British had.
The British needed to replace their fleet of aging aircraft, the light air attack Jaguar and the US Phantom fighters. They were reliable, but couldn't cope with the Soviet aircraft. But jobs were important too. The Labour government of the early 60s caused an outrage when it cancelled a British fighter programme in favour of the American Phantom. Thousands of British workers were left without a job. Politically, this couldn't be repeated, and the new fighter would have to be made in Europe. For Chris Granville-White, then of the Ministry of Defence and a former RAF pilot, there was already a successful joint venture, the Tornado programme, that would serve as a role model for a new, wider European collaboration.
So in the early part of 1983, we went and talked to some of the other air forces, and it was fairly obvious who we should talk to. We talked to our former Tornado partners, the Germans and the Italians. We talked to the French, because we'd had the Anglo-French Jaguar programme.
Just when there was the spark of a possible collaboration between these four nations, the Spanish applied to join them.
At that time, we knew that it was not only beneficial from a strategic point of view, which it is definitely, but also from an industrial point of view. And we foresaw that it could represent a lot of jobs creating.
The idea was that by sharing work and resources, the five nations would obtain an expensive aircraft at a lower cost to each country. But not everyone was in harmony.
The interest, particularly in four of the nations, was primarily air-to-air, air superiority, air defence and air-to-air combat. And that was applicable to four of the nations as a primary requirement, and then with a secondary requirement of air-to-surface to varying degrees between the four nations. France had a different perspective, which was, it was complementary, but it was different in that their primary requirement was offensive air-to-surface, and then with the air-to-air, air superiority capability as a second facet to that. So we always had this slight difference between four and one nations, and it was a question of seeing how we could balance these out.
The French government and their manufacturers Dassault persisted in promoting their air-to-ground fighter design over the air-to-air design favoured by the other four countries. Nevertheless, negotiations for the fighter programme continued for 2 years. Martin Fremer, a German engineer, had already collaborated on the Tornado with the British. He was invited to work on the new project.
Our task was to come together on one project, one program, one cost estimates, and obviously one management. And this was the task of that exercise, and we were quite successful actually of achieving this. Because in that period from 83 to 85, we established on a quinteral base, including Dassault, a project. We managed to define the development cost. We had the work share established.
Despite the optimism, the first cracks in the new European venture began to show.
Now other news, and European defence ministers are meeting in London in a last attempt to save their joint project for new fighter aircraft. 5 NATO countries had planned to spend £20 billion, but it seems they can't reach agreement.
It's more than 2 years since Britain, France, Germany, Italy and Spain first talked about developing a joint fighter for the 1990s.
And we were close in believing that we can continue on the quintilateral base. However, at the end we failed.
In 1985, irreconcilable differences on the design led the French to leave the negotiating table. They saw their security better served by a ground attack aircraft and went on to develop the Rafale at great cost. But there was more to their departure than met the eye.
It was, in essence, the control of the program. They were requesting all major posts in the organization, like the program management, the commercial side, and even the technical side. To a certain degree, I still regret that they haven't continued with us, because I believe this aircraft would have even more chances now than it has already.
But losing one partner didn't alter the 4 remaining nations' confidence in the project. Although they had lost 2 years in negotiations with the French, they were still optimistic.
So the aim was get this aircraft into service in the early to mid-1990s. But all the indications were that probably the costs could be kept down and that the aircraft could be in service as early as 1992, and that from then onwards it would be a matter of progressing its upgrades until around 2002.
These ambitions proved impossible to fulfill. On the management side, although the 4 governments, their air forces and 8 defence contractors had the same objectives, they all had different incentives to take part. On the engineering side, the specifications were going to be somewhat more complicated than those faced by their colleagues on civilian programs. The problem is explained by Dave Rees, test pilot coordinator for the program.
Building a military fighter is so different to building an airliner. In the case of the airliner, the flight control system has to cope with a benign flying envelope. In simple terms, it's got to cope with a takeoff, a cruise, a landing. Nice and smooth, no spilling of the gin and tonic, some gentle turns, easy. As long as it does it safely, it's done its task. If you now think of the flight control system of an agile fighter, it's a different ballgame. It's got to cope with rapid rolling. It's got to cope with 9G. It's got to cope with very aggressive flying on the part of the pilot. It's a far more challenging exercise for the flight control system to manage.
So challenging, in fact, that negotiations took another 3 years. And it was not until 1988 that the 4 nations finally signed a contract for the development phase of the project. They agreed to build 7 prototypes of what was now to be called the European Fighter Aircraft, or EFA, with full production commencing in 1992, when work would begin on 765 fighters. The first planes would be delivered to their respective air forces in 1998. The cost in prices of the day was projected to be £20 billion. But just as it was getting underway, the collaboration reached its second major obstacle, with the fallout from the collapse of the Berlin Wall. In 1989, and literally overnight, the Berlin Wall crumbled to pieces. The following 3 years would see the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the end of the Soviet Union. The Cold War imperative that created the Eurofighter vanished. Just as the first prototypes were being built, the future of the program was in question.
Suddenly here was a reunited Germany, and it was very, very clear from the beginning that the German government needed to invest in Eastern Germany to bring them up to speed with the West. In other words, they needed to spend money, invest money. Now, the first thing that governments do is, when they have this situation, is cut defence programmes. It doesn't matter what it is. You can never cut education or health or social services. It's always defence which goes first.
And sure enough, in the 1990 German electoral campaign, Chancellor Helmut Kohl promised his anti-war supporters to cancel the EFA should he remain Chancellor. Once re-elected, Kohl's Defence Secretary Volker Ruhr threatened to opt out of the programme. The future of the 4 nations' aircraft industry depended on his final decision.
Mr. Ruhr and his British counterpart Malcolm Rifkind looked cheerful enough, but their talks today produced no agreement. The German government says the technology tested for the European fighter on this demonstrator aircraft should now be used to develop a cheaper, lighter plane. Britain objects, but Germany still says it wants a new fighter to be more in keeping with a Europe no longer threatened by Soviet invasion. This afternoon, though, Mr. Ruhr was anxious to maintain a good relationship with Britain. I don't want it to end with the European fighter, he said, but times had changed.
We very definitely feel that there is a new situation in Europe, and the plane has to adjust to the security situation and not the other way around.
In the UK, Ruhr's argument was not well received. Fearing for their jobs, hundreds of British aerospace workers protested in London. The pressure was on Malcolm Rifkind, the newly appointed Defence Secretary to John Major's cabinet, to ensure the Eurofighter would continue.
When you arrive as new Defence Secretary and there is this immediate high drama of whether the biggest procurement program ever in British defence history might collapse, then it's quite an awesome challenge to be given sort of the day after you've arrived in the department.
The tension between the nations was mounting. How the EFA costs could be reduced was at the centre of the debate. Feasibility studies were carried out by the 4 partner nations to check whether or not the EFA was still the most cost-effective option.
While we recognized and understood the German position, it was necessary to try and get across to them that this idea of withdrawal was not a serious option. I think what made it possible for us to do so was that the German government didn't simply say, we must find a cheaper alternative. If they'd simply said that, what that would have in fact meant is buy American. But for a mixture of political and other reasons, the German government didn't feel able to say that. They said, we must scrap Eurofighter and build a less expensive European fighter. Now, once they said that, they were bound to lose, because so much had already been spent on Eurofighter that if we'd had to scrap all that and go back to the drawing board and design a new aircraft, even a less sophisticated one, in theory that might be less expensive. In practice, the cost would have been far, far greater.
Volker Ruhr turned down our request for an interview. But back in 1997, he justified his actions.
In the beginning, the British gave the impression as if they had all the money of the world, as if they didn't care about the price. Later on, they all congratulated me that it was good to interfere with the old project and to save some money. Also, good British money has been saved.
Martin Freemer was working on the project at the time. He does not remember his government's vacillations as being so helpful.
It was actually a not easy situation the program went into. Now, obviously, to this situation, we continued with the work as good as possible, but with the threat that it's not going to continue, the motivation was gone, and it took us quite a lot of effort to keep the program going as necessary and as we have been obliged relative to our partners.
Production slowed down. The first prototypes, initially expected to perform their maiden flight in 1991, were still on the ground. The prospect of them ever taking off was very slim, as the 4 nations were still locked in what seemed then a no-way-out situation. To make matters worse, Italy, short of cash then, had rallied to Germany's side.
The budgetary crisis and German withdrawal are causing Italian ministers to think again about the wisdom of the European fighter. They say that unless the plane can be made much more cheaply, they'll follow the German lead and leave the project, leaving Spain and Britain stranded.
Though not for long. After several weeks of intense diplomatic effort, the Italians were persuaded to rejoin, isolating the Germans' defense minister. By unilaterally backing out of the program, Volker Ruhr faced the prospect of having to compensate the other nations for the disruption. Ruhr's predecessors had locked themselves into the project by a punitive penalty system of their own devising. German defense analyst Ottfried Nassauer has followed the project from the very beginning.
Germany itself participated in negotiating a contract, which made it so difficult to leave. And it was his predecessors' wish that it should be so difficult to leave the program because the predecessor feared that smaller countries might opt out.
It was now just a matter of time before the Germans caved in.
As the heads of government met in one room, Volcker and I went into another. And by that stage, the kind of conclusion that was emerging was becoming pretty evident. It was really a question of crossing the T's and dotting the I's and finding a form of words that made it not too painful for Volcker to acknowledge that the program was going to continue. And we had a very good, very constructive discussion, and were able to report to our respective Prime Minister and Chancellor that agreement had been reached. And so a press conference was held, and everyone said this is exactly what they'd wanted all along, which was more true for some of us than for others.
The EFA programme had also reached the point of no return so often experienced on major projects. Too much money had already been invested, too many promises made, and already thousands of jobs were reliant on the programme. And the reality was that no head of government was prepared to let that go.
It was just too expensive to go back to square one. And of course, it's a combination of objectives. It's not only meeting the needs of your armed forces, that's clearly the most important objective, but you want to do that in a way that helps support your own indigenous aircraft industry. And British Aerospace, for example, and other British companies, a large number, dozens of British companies, had a huge industrial commitment, jobs and resources at stake here.
So by the end of 1992, the programme's future was secure. But the delay caused by Germany's indecision was having a profound effect on costs.
It's my view that one person is responsible for the delays and cost overruns on Eurofighter, and that's the German Defence Minister Volcker. Any thoughts that he has that he made it cheaper or easier are just not substantiated by the facts. The aircraft, as a result of the delays, as a result of the redesign work, became substantially more expensive, probably to the order of 40 to 50% more expensive than it needed to have been.
So by 1993, full production had to be delayed until 1995, the number of planes staying at 765, with the delivery date to the Air Forces being postponed to 2000. Estimated total cost had risen to £41 billion. Although Germany was back in, months of renegotiation now ensued among all the interested parties. Although the basic design remained the same, each nation wanted to adjust the plane to suit its own particular needs. It didn't make the plane any cheaper.
What should have been an airplane with standard kit inside became an airplane where everybody had different kit inside because everybody had different requirements. Everybody was allowed to go for a cheap option or a medium price option or an expensive option. So instead of getting a lot of the economies of scale that should have been there in the first place, in order to shave off money here, to shave off money there, we ended up with 4 almost different aircrafts.
Nevertheless, the 4 nations stuck to the basic workshare arrangement of 1988. The British were to build the cockpit nose and tail, and to share the construction of the rear fuselage and engine with Italy, which was also to build the left wing. The Spanish were to build the right wing, the Germans the central fuselage, as well as the flight control system. Against all the odds, it was the Germans who were the first to get their prototype off the ground in March 1994. This was the first real milestone of the project.
Eurofighter 2000 represents unity of vision, unity of purpose, and an inspirational example of technological cooperation and achievement.
A month later, the British unveiled their prototype at the British Aerospace Factory in Warton, Lancashire. The EFA was now renamed the Eurofighter 2000.
It has created jobs, brought security, prosperity, and creative energy to thousands of aerospace workers, their families, and the wider community.
The euphoria was premature.
The projected overall cost of the new Eurofighter, which is made by Britain, Germany, Italy and Spain, is now put at £40 billion. Of that, British taxpayers will have to pay almost £15 billion. In its highly critical report, the National Audit Office says the project's rigid work-share arrangements are to blame for most of the delays and cost rises. Labour said the report was a damning indictment of the lack of adequate management control within the Ministry of Defence.
The work share had been apportioned in the following way, with Britain and Germany each taking 33%, Italy 21% and Spain 13%. Eurofighter 2000 brought hundreds of contracts to the four nations' industries. The work was allocated according to the number of planes each country planned to buy, and this meant that contracts didn't always go to the best supplier. According to one aerospace expert, the flight control system was the victim of this work distribution.
Nobody wanted to make, if you like, the cheap and cheerful things like the cushions or the ashtrays or the armrests. Everybody wanted the cutting-edge technology, the computers, the aerodynamics, the engines, all the good things that make it possible. The Germans, because of the money put in, wanted the flying control system, a crucial thing in this all-electric aeroplane, computerized. The trouble was the Germans hadn't built a control system on a fast aeroplane since 1945. It was, to be frank, beyond them at the time, and it was only rescued by other people coming to help in the mid-90s. So one of the reasons why the Eurofighter was delayed was not just politics, it was technology, and people should, in future, if they can, allocate work share on the basis of proven track record and experience, not just the amount of money people put into the pot.
The original agreement had allotted the British and Germans 250 planes each, giving both a third of the work share. But Germany, having confirmed its commitment to the project, dropped another bombshell. Mr. Ruhr demanded to nearly halve Germany's order to 140 planes, and yet retain the country's original 33% share of the workload, employment and technology.
We will not give in with regard to the work share, but we're in the midst of negotiations.
Eurofighter was under threat again. Any more delays would be catastrophic. The partners eventually agreed to reduce the total number of fighters to 620 from 765. The UK now ordered 232 planes, giving them a share of 37%. The Germans settled for 180 planes with a share of 30%. The Italians and the Spanish sharing the remaining third between them.
It certainly gave British Aerospace, one of the partners in the programme, the capability of having more work share than the Germans. Now that meant that they were in the driving seat. They were able to direct the way the programme went and the schedule that the programme met. And that was considered to be politically far better than having the Germans there, who were subject to the whims of the Bundestag.
The bad work-share arrangements were not the only reproach made by the National Audit Office. They also blamed the lack of cohesion between the partners for the delays and rising costs. For a collaboration to function smoothly, the partners needed to harmonise their working methods. In the early years of the programme, nationalism was still very much anchored in the partners' mentality. Although they were keen to cooperate, they were reluctant to adopt new management tools. It took years for a common working method to be implemented. The next big test was the Dubai Air Show, where rival fighters were able to demonstrate their agility in the air. The years of delays became embarrassingly apparent when Eurofighter 2000 remained firmly on the ground.
Around about that time, a couple of other aircraft programs had experienced accidents. We didn't want to fall to that problem, and so a conscious decision was made in flight test to take a stepwise, softly approach. And therefore, in those early displays, the aircraft was being constrained because we didn't want to push the limits too far.
The Eurofighter at the Dubai Air Show was just a large-scale model. Among the competition present at the show was the former French partner. Their plane, the Rafale, was demonstrating great agility in the air. They were ecstatic. As a competitor, Eurofighter was off the horizon.
There's no competition for the Rafale. All the aircraft is well developed, you know, the Eurofighter is not here. That's the problem. Why it's not here? It's not a real aircraft who's there.
Just a few months after the Dubai Air Show debacle, power changed hands in the UK. With any new government come new expectations. The Eurofighter had been the Tories' pet project since day one, and it was assumed that Labour would reassess the most expensive procurement programme in the UK as part of their strategic defence review. To the consternation of some observers, that wasn't to be.
You must remember in the Strategic Defence Review, two things were off bounds. One was the British nuclear deterrent, the second was the Eurofighter. So the Strategic Defence Review, although it confirmed it, strictly speaking, was not allowed to examine the whole project. I think that with hindsight, had it been put into the melting pot, it might well have decided that 232 was no longer required. But because that was off bounds, off limits, then 232 was confirmed, almost on the nod.
The production contract was signed in 1998, although it was already apparent that the delivery date of 2000 would not be met. Eurofighter 2000 was renamed Eurofighter Typhoon. The much-awaited production phase was to begin the same year for the same total of 620 planes, and delivery was further postponed until 2002. The reduced order resulted in a reduced cost to an estimated £39 billion in 1998 prices. The four nations were now accelerating the pace of flight test operations, and the assembly lines were put into action. As they did so, it became clear that the whole nature of conflicts had changed. Peacekeeping and policing missions were the priority. The need for fighter aircraft had diminished in favour of high-altitude precision bombers. Some seriously started to doubt that the Eurofighter Typhoon would meet the defence need of the partner nations.
Technologically, I don't think it's advanced. It's a Cold War dinosaur, advanced for its time, but no longer relevant. We require ground attack capabilities much more than we require air-to-air combat capabilities. The Eurofighter only has that as a secondary role and function. So the Eurofighter has a limited role in the everyday operations in the contemporary security environment.
That's wrong. I mean, no expeditionary warfare or any other warfare can take place without control of the air. You need to protect your ships and your troops from being attacked by the bad guys in the air. You need a frontline aeroplane like Eurofighter to guarantee that air cover.
The plane's biggest fans are the pilots. For them, Eurofighter Typhoon offers something unique. Not only is it multi-role, but it's also swing-role, which means it can switch mission in the air at the flip of a button. Craig Penrice, as a British test pilot, has flown hundreds of hours on the Typhoon and spent weeks in the simulator.
We're in what we call the active cockpit, which is a simulator that we use to explore a lot of the various missions of Eurofighter. Today I'm in an airplane that's got a simulated load of both air-to-air and air-to-surface weapons, which will allow us to look at the swing roll capabilities of the airplane. Make the last switch. The displays change automatically to give me the engine's information as we take off.
Craig's mission is to bomb a power station. Before reaching his target, he's surrounded by enemy fighters. In the swing-roll Eurofighter, he can fire missiles at them and then continue his bombing mission.
Commit the bomb to go.
Although the missions remain to be performed for real, the industry test pilots are adamant that Eurofighter Typhoon is the best option for the Air Forces.
There's some things that are simply completely marvelous about this airplane, and one of them is the cockpit. You know, the workplace of the pilot, and it is a cockpit made by pilots for pilots, and it just makes life so much easier, and will for the operational pilots. That everything is in the right place, the information is there when you need it. There's not too much of it or not too little of it, and I think that's gonna will be proven right when the guys get their hands on the machine.
But when that would be was still the vital question on everybody's lips. Several delivery dates had been missed already, and by the end of 2002, although the RAF was putting on a brave face, they still didn't know when they would get their first aircraft.
For the first flight of an airplane off the production line, pretty impressive stuff. At Farnborough, those of you who were
At the annual Typhoon seminar at the RAF in Uxbridge, Air Commodore Chris Harper was assuring the audience that despite all the delays, Eurofighter Typhoon was still the aircraft of choice.
But it is, ladies and gentlemen, tantalizingly close. And let me tell you that when PMA look at all of the officers' OJARs, the annual confidential reports as they used to be, those coming from the front line, it is numbered on one hand that you can find one which doesn't include Typhoon as the top option for our frontline guys to fly in the near future.
If the delays were testing the patience of the RAF, the industrial side of the partnership remained sanguine.
Eurofighter is a complex weapon system. We have agreed with the customer to deliver the weapon system only when it's mature. The fine-tuning of the weapon system requires some time.
The most daring feature on Eurofighter is the ultra-sophisticated flight control software, which should remove 80% of the pilot's workload. But this system and other problems were still causing delays.
There's several reasons for the delays. One reason is that parts have been produced that were improperly produced and needed to be redone. And another reason is that the program is still facing some technological problems. One of them, as far as I believe, being the flight control system, still not fully capable of what it should do. And the flight control system is absolutely crucial because the aircraft is aerodynamically unstable and therefore needs a perfect software to make the aircraft flying.
By late 2002, it was becoming apparent that the program was yet again behind schedule. The flight control system was not the only factor. Over 1,400 component changes had been made and tested in the past 2.5 years. And during a routine test flight in Spain, Eurofighter Typhoon suffered another setback. In its 8-year history of test flights, the Eurofighter had acquired an exemplary flight safety record. But on the 21st of November 2002, the Spanish prototype DA6 took off and never returned. It appears that both engines shut down, forcing the plane to crash. Both pilot and passenger safely ejected. A subsequent investigation points to a mechanical fault in an early prototype engine design that has now been superseded by engines where a similar fault is impossible. Soon after the crash, the four governments announced they would delay delivery of the aircraft until June 2003. Their main reasons for this decision were the slow progress made by industry on minor details. The loss of DA6 was cited as adding further uncertainty. Furthermore, as the Second Gulf War demonstrated, in a long-range missile and bombers war, fighter planes like the Eurofighter are unnecessary if the enemy has no viable air force, and the first phase of Eurofighter production is mainly for air-to-air combat. This confirms the arguments of those who believe that the Eurofighter program has failed to adjust to changing military requirements. One such critic is Sue Willett.
From a strategic point of view, I think it has been a major failure because it shows the inertia and inability of both the Ministry of Defence or industry to be able to adapt rapidly to a changing strategic environment, and that what we've ended up with is an old dinosaur, and a very expensive one at that.
Eurofighter is not a white elephant. It's a creation of the Cold War, yes, but it's evolved. It was originally very much an air defence fighter with a very secondary air-to-ground and reconnaissance capability. It's developed that air-to-ground capability such that it's far better than it's set out to be, and its reconnaissance capability is far better than it's set out to be. So like every thoroughbred, it's evolved to meet the changing generations. So it's pure Darwinism at work. It's evolved, it's not stood still, and I don't think it's right to compare this to the aeroplane that was conceived in 1985.
Finally, on the 30th of June 2003, the Eurofighter was ready for delivery. Representatives of the four nations, including Britain's Defence Minister Lord Bach, assembled at Eurofighter headquarters in Manching, Germany. It had taken 6 more months of adjustments and negotiations for the plane to be judged to have met the standards required by the 4 customer air forces, a process known as type acceptance. Years of trials still lie ahead, and the plane is now being adapted for a ground offence role.
Germany, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom. And as we sit here today, aircrew has signed the type acceptance commemorative documents.
The customers remain upbeat and suggest that lessons have been learned.
Air superiority is everything in modern warfare. If you don't have control of the skies, you haven't got much chance of winning. Now, with Eurofighter, we have really the best air superiority plane in the world. When you are going in for this kind of collaboration, it's very important the 4 nations involved, or however many it may be, don't insist that everything has to fit in exactly in terms of employment in one country, what parts will be built in another country, and that there should be some central organisation that's powerful enough to be able to run the procurement without having to look over its shoulder all the time. We always, of course, are looking at our defence equipment programme, which sensible government wouldn't. We always have to just check and make sure. The fact is, though, we are a partnership, and that if any country decided for whatever reason to build more, build less, then it would be duty-bound to go to its other partners and discuss the issue. We must not get stuck in any mires, even if we did in the past.
There is now a new initiative to streamline the project's decision-making process, although the British government have recently announced that the project is now costing the British taxpayer £20 billion. The total cost to the 4 nations is well over £50 billion. By some management criteria, a project that overruns by 10 years and is billions of pounds over budget should be considered a failure. But when compared with similar defence programmes, a pattern begins to emerge.
I don't think I'd accept that Eurofighter is a failure. Eurofighter has been a victim of bad management and some appalling political decisions. Look at Eurofighter and compare it perhaps to the F-22 in the United States. That's an aircraft which is only just entering production. It's late. It's over budget. We don't hear the criticism of it because, of course, it's not a collaborative program.
Even the French, who at one point had the advantage, seem to have run into trouble with the Rafale.
The French Air Force have yet to make a substantial stake in Rafale. The French Navy have got some aircraft on order for the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, but it's still, we're talking of less than 100 aircraft. Now there's a requirement out there for 620 Eurofighters. Now that's 6 times more.
There is another defence of the programme. The sheer size of the project means new technology has been developed among the 4 partner nations. Up to tens of thousands of jobs have been sustained.
Large programs like the Eurofighter are also means for doing and conducting industrial politics. Many nations procure such an aircraft even though they know that industries will promise more than they can stick to, just because they believe that the technology is crucial and that they should exist in one's own country, and that it's easier to justify if the taxpayers' money is spent within the country than, in comparison, if it would be spent to buy off the shelf from abroad.
The debate still continues on the military merit of the Eurofighter. But what lessons have been learned from Europe's biggest ever defence project?
That it is not easy to combine. On the face of it, let's join with other nations, that makes it cheap and cheerful and simple. It doesn't work like that. The costs can nearly be as much as they were if you'd done it on your own, but the political advantage is you don't cancel because you've got 3 other friends who won't let you. If we, the Brits, had built this, we may have cancelled years ago as not affording. We couldn't afford to back out. The Germans would certainly have cancelled, but they couldn't afford to back out. I'm sure the Italians and Spanish have thought long and hard about backing out. But if you go in together, you all force each other to go forward, and none of you can afford to step back. And that's a great plus in an age when defence isn't the #1 priority on most people's minds.
It seems that the weaknesses of giant multi-nation collaborations like the Eurofighter are also their strengths. Whether the partner nations reduce their orders or not, hundreds of planes are being built. The Eurofighter is scheduled to enter operational service in 2006, 23 years after it was first conceived. With upgrades, it's likely to remain part of Europe's military arsenal until 2050. Only then will we be able to judge whether it was worth it.